Bad company corrupts good morals. Who of you have heard that expression? Bad company corrupts good morals. Or perhaps if you grew up Afrikaans or know Afrikaans well, you will have heard the expression meng jou met die semels en die varke vreet jou op. You mix yourself in with the pig food, the pigs will eat you up. Or perhaps another expression that is similar to this is the idea that when you, actually I forget the expression now, but when you mix with people who are of a lower moral standard, then you will become like them. You will have your own morals corrupted. And it's striking that in our passage, Jesus clearly does the opposite. Now we have to be clear, there is a sense in which this is true, and we have to teach our children to choose their friends carefully. And that is all good and true. But there is also another aspect which Jesus shows us, and that is that Jesus himself, holy as he is willing to identify with and spend time with sinners. In our passage, Mark shows us that Jesus openly associates with extremely sinful people. In this passage, Jesus brings grace to the ghastly, salvation to sinners, he shows care for the crass, shows love for the lost. Jesus associates with the worst of the worst in order to show all what mercy really is. And this should come as a comfort to us, because we are those who are in need. We are sinful people who need the grace of God as he has revealed it in Christ. Now, in the previous passage in Mark chapter 2, verse 1 to 13, we saw that Jesus has the authority to forgive sins. Now, in this passage, we see who it is that may come to Jesus to receive this forgiveness from him. Now, before we begin with our passage, and perhaps I should say this evening, I'm not going to give you headings for the passage. We'll just follow the flow of the passage beginning in verse 13 and move through up to verse 17. If you do like to have some kind of a picture of structure in your head, in verse 13 and 14, we see an individual sinner called, and then in verses 15, 16 and 17, we see Jesus relating to a crowd of sinners, so beginning with the individual and moving to the group. But before we come to verse 13, I want to make a comment on a concept that is very much in the Reformed confessions. We can read various passages. We can read especially from the Canons of Dort. We can read from the Westminster Confession. The Heidelberg Catechism has references to this idea. And all throughout the Reformed confessions, we have reference to a concept that has come to be known, although not by that name in the confessions itself, but in Reformed theology as the free offer of the gospel. The concept that the gospel of free grace should be freely offered to all men. In fact, the scriptures call us to bear witness to this world that if you come to Christ, you will be saved. We believe in predestination. We believe in election, that God determines from before the foundation of the world who will belong to him, who will be the people who are his children. We believe that because the scriptures reveal that. And yet that does not mean that we say we limit those to whom the gospel may be proclaimed. And that is what Jesus shows us. Again, not by those words itself, but he shows us that his grace should be proclaimed. It should be made available to all to come to him. This is what Jesus shows us in this passage. Beginning in verse 13. He went out again beside the sea, and all the crowd was coming to him, and he was teaching them. Now, verse 13 really is a transition verse from the previous section into this section. By this transition, Mark reminds us about a couple of things about Jesus' ministry. There's always crowds following Jesus, and Jesus always teaches the people. Now when Mark in this transition verse refers again to Jesus' teaching, he makes again the point that our religion, our understanding, our faith is one that is intimately intellectual. It is something for which we need our minds, as we heard in the reading of the law as well, that we ought to love the Lord with all our mind. There is no Christian faith, Christian religion, Christian understanding, or Christian worldview without the engagement of the mind. Just think about how the Apostle Paul says in Romans 12 verse 2, "Be transformed by the renewal of your mind." So the heart must be affected, the whole life must be affected, but it happens through the mind. But there's another reason, I believe, why Mark tells us or reminds us about this aspect of this emphasis of Jesus on teaching in this specific passage. We will see why that is when we come to verse 17 or later in this passage. We also think about this transforming of the being transformed by the renewal of our minds when we think about that famous passage in Luke chapter 24, where Jesus walks with his disciples on the road to Emmaus after his being resurrected and they fail to recognize him, and he teaches them again. And then they say afterwards, "Did not our hearts burn within us while he talked to us on the road, while he opened to us the scriptures?" So you see, their hearts were burning. Their hearts were lit up by joy and thankfulness. So it's not that the heart remained unaffected, and yet it happened through the opening up of the scriptures. The exposition of scripture lit up their hearts. I can say to you that this is often my prayer before we come to worship, that by the exposition of the scriptures, those who hear the preaching of the word will have their hearts lit up in hearing of who Jesus is. Now Mark notes again this priority of teaching in one sense as a reminder, but also as something of a contrast that we will see in later verses in this passage. But he also in this transition verse sets us up for what happens in verse 14. That's of course the point of the transition. He brings us into the next section, into the next point in the passage. In verse 14 we read, "And as he passed by, he saw Levi, the son of Alphaeus, sitting at the tax booth, and he said to him, 'Follow me,' and he rose and followed him." As he passed by, the first phrase there, Jesus was walking alongside the sea, as he was when he called the previous 4 disciples. He was walking by the sea, and he had a crowd following him, and he was teaching them. Now this might sound strange to us, but this was quite common in Jesus' day, that a rabbi would walk. It's referred to as the peripatetic ministries of a rabbi, because peripateo means to walk. And so the rabbi would walk, and he would have a group of people following him, and he would speak as he walks. You can imagine, for us who know something about having to travel for long periods of time, when you travel to and from work, for some of us at least, that you like to listen to a podcast of some kind, and some information must go into the head, otherwise that time feels as if it was wasted. And so it makes sense if you travel by foot, that when you walk from one town to another, and it maybe takes a day or 2 days, that you can use that time wisely in this kind of ministry. A rabbi having to travel from one town to another, he would walk there, have his group of people with him, and as he goes, he teaches them all the while. Now this is common practice. So Jesus walking along the seashore there, and he is teaching his disciples. And as he goes, he sees a man that is called Levi. Levi, the son of Alphaeus. Now this Levi is almost certainly the same man that we know by the name Matthew, who is the author of the Gospel according to Matthew. We see the parallel account in Matthew chapter 9 verse 9, and there he is called Matthew, and is called Matthew elsewhere throughout the Gospels. And he's sitting at a tax booth, which really means only one thing. He is a tax collector. This man is a tax collector. Now we have to understand something about tax collectors in the day of Jesus in order to understand what this means. Now, the first thing that perhaps comes to our minds when we realize that this man is a tax collector is that he might be something like a SARS employee. I think for most of us, I think for anyone who earns an income, the idea of a tax collector or a SARS employee is already enough of a repellent that you don't feel too positively about this guy. But that's not the picture. That's not what you have to see when you think about Levi, about Matthew. What you rather have to begin to think about is a couple of different kinds of people that we know in our society as well. The first one is more something like a corrupt government official. It's the kind of person who takes money from people by illegal means. Well, it's even worse, in fact, but because in the tax collector situation it was made legal, but it was still extortion. He was still taking money from people with no good reason. So you have to get this idea, a corrupt government official kind of person. But then it's again worse than that, because it is also the idea of a loan shark. A loan shark with thugs. He comes to your house. He tells you, listen, where's the cash? And he takes some of it. Now it's worse than a loan shark, because with a loan shark, at least the loan shark loaned out the money in the first place. Now, these tax collectors were the worst of the worst. In fact, they were so bad that they were even worse than this. They were also considered traitors. You see, the big thing is that they were Jews. They were from the Jewish nation, and they were tasked with the point of gaining tax, or getting this income through Jewish people, typically. Not only from Jews, but especially from Jews in a sense. And so how this worked was that they were to say that they are going to gain a certain amount of income, and then they would get the job of a tax collector, and then everything above that they could take for themselves. So you can imagine that he works up to the point of the quota that he has to pay over to the crown, to Caesar, or to whoever it is, and then he works all the more to gain for himself what he can. They were typically very rich. And they were traitors, so the Jews hate them. They hated them so much that the Pharisees, now remember, the Pharisees were the strictest of the strict in law keeping. And these Pharisees said, we may not break the law for any reason at any time. Among the Pharisees there were still different sects. Some of them had differences among themselves. But there's one thing that they all agreed on. Tax collectors are so bad that you may lie to them. So one person to whom you may lie was a tax collector. These were really the worst of the worst kind of people. And when Jesus calls this man, this tax collector, if you think again about Mark's gospel as something of a play, you can almost hear the audience gasp when Jesus calls a tax collector to be his follower, to be his disciple. And then we see in the verse again, Matthew, Levi, when he's called, that he responds immediately. He just follows Jesus. He leaves his tax booth. He leaves his ability to generate that income, that very handsome income, just leaves it immediately and follows Jesus. But Matthew being called to be Jesus' disciple, it sets us up for the next section of this passage, but it's also a picture of what comes next. Jesus calling this sinful man, Jesus associating with this man, making this man one of his own, one of his closest and most intimate friends. This is what we see then in verse 15 and onwards. Now Jesus called Levi, Levi becomes his follower, and then we read in verse 15, "And as he reclined at table in his house, many tax collectors and sinners were reclining with Jesus and his disciples, for there were many who followed him." Now they were reclining in Matthew's house, in Levi's house, and Luke actually is quite explicit that Luke wanted to have this feast. Matthew put on this feast. And you can see the picture. He was called by Jesus. He has now gone into a new state of life completely. Things have changed. And he wants his old friends to know Jesus. You have to think about the kinds of people that hang around with tax collectors. Well, could be more tax collectors, the thugs that they use when they go to someone's house to extort money, and most often prostitutes. In fact, Jesus himself in Matthew 21, verse 31 to 32, lumps together tax collectors and prostitutes. They are basically the same kind of people. Now, that's also what stands behind the word sinners in this passage. Jesus reclined at table in the house of many tax collectors and sinners. It's important that we realize this, because we might be tempted to read this passage and think, oh, they were called sinners in the sense that the Pharisees considered them sinners. And what would be the Pharisees' standard for someone to be called a sinner? Well, they would have to be someone who doesn't do what the Pharisees do. That's someone they would call a sinner. But that's not the standard of sinner that we should think about in this passage. In this passage, we should really think about those who hang out with tax collectors. Tax collectors, thugs, prostitutes, and so on. Then it becomes so shocking to hear that Jesus was reclining with them at table. Now, this idea of reclining at table is not as strange as it is to us. The idea that they lay down around a table. That's how they would eat. Not every meal, but especially big meals, feast-like meals. They would recline. They would make a time of this. This was intimate fellowship around a meal. It's probably the most intimate kind of time that you can spend with anyone that is not your wife. This is real intimacy. Jesus reclines with these people around a table in a tax collector's house. Now, even this, in a sense, I believe, if we see the picture, should shock us. Even though we have read this passage many times, even though we kind of have this idea of that this is who Jesus is, that he was willing to associate with sinful people. Jesus is at table eating with tax collectors and sinners, tax collectors and prostitutes. Now, Jesus involves in this meal also his disciples. He brings them along. They eat with him, with these tax collectors and sinners. Now, at this point, you really have to start to feel the tension building in this passage. What will happen now? What Jesus is eating with these people. You know that there's always, in Mark's Gospel, there's always a scribe or a Pharisee just around the corner waiting to pounce and to say, look at what he's doing wrong. And exactly that is the case. And so you come to verse 17, and there they are. The scribes of the Pharisees, when they saw that he was eating with sinners and tax collectors, said to his disciples, "Why does he eat with tax collectors and sinners?" Now notice that it says the scribes of the Pharisees. In other words, this is a smaller group within the sect of the Pharisees. The scribes of the Pharisees. These were you see, you had the Pharisees, but not all of the Pharisees would be scribes. Scribes were those who were trained in the law. You can say they were the strictest of the strict. The Pharisees were strict, but the scribes of the Pharisees were those who spent all their waking moments trying to figure out exactly how the law should be applied in every specific instance. And they cornered the disciples. Now, often we like to ask the question, why do they corner the disciples? Why do they ask the disciples and not Jesus? And there might be many good answers. Some say it's because he the narrative situation doesn't allow for it. Jesus is in the house and they are outside. Perhaps they are not ready to engage in controversy with Jesus. Perhaps they are cautious of Jesus. He did, in just the previous passage, put them in their place by knowing their thoughts. And so perhaps they're unsure. But maybe at this point, Mark doesn't want us to ask that question. What Mark does want us to see is that their question implies disapproval. Now that's in a sense obvious. When you read this passage, you immediately get the feeling that these scribes and Pharisees are unhappy with Jesus and with what he is doing. But you have to get a sense of this question. Why does he eat with tax collectors and sinners? Almost, how dare he eat with tax collectors and sinners? Is he not saying that, is he not a Jew? Is he not a rabbi? Did he not say that he is the Son of Man, the Son of God? Is he not holy? Is he not righteous? How can he go to table with prostitutes, sinners, tax collectors? It's impossible. You see, perhaps there is a hint of the reason why they are asking the disciples is that they are actually already beginning to try to tarnish Jesus' reputation. They are trying to tell people, the people around them, he's not as good as he says. They're certainly not out to try and protect Jesus, saying he shouldn't be eating with him. He will corrupt his good morals. That's certainly not their point. But Jesus, in doing so, makes the point very clear. Grace comes to the ghastly. Grace comes to those who are most undeserving. Really, Jesus makes the point. Grace comes to everyone. It's very important that we see this. In verse 17, it becomes clear. When Jesus heard this, the question that they asked, he said to them, "Those who are well have no need of a physician, but those who are sick. I came not to call the righteous, but sinners." Now Jesus in this verse uses an illustration, and then he puts the illustration in terms of the reality that it illustrates. The illustration is that of a doctor. It says a physician, a doctor, one who heals sick people. One who heals sick people, if that's your occupation, then what is the point of trying to exercise your occupation in a situation where there's no one to heal? If that is the point of what you want to do, then why do you waste your time going around with healthy people? Jesus is saying something about his mission. He's saying that he has a mission. We'll see the details of that now. And if he does not go to these people that he is going to, he has missed the point of his mission. The illustration really is fairly easy to understand. One thing that we must realize is that in those days, house calls for doctors were much more common than it is today. Most of us, when we want to see a doctor, when we are in need of a doctor, we go to the doctor's waiting room and you sit there feeling, if I'm not sick already, I will get sick now. And you sit there and you wait for the doctor. But the point is that you go to the doctor. Whereas in Jesus' day, that might have been the case in some instances, but much more readily, the doctor would go out to those who are sick. And it's important that we see this, because if we don't, we might turn this passage on its head and say that we ought to be these sick sinner people looking for the doctor. But that's not the point that Jesus is making. Jesus is not making the point that you ought to be all like these sick people, or these sinners. He's not saying that you should be feeling bad about yourself and about your sin. I'm making this quite explicit because I believe that this is often the emphasis from this passage or similar passages. You must first come to some measure of repentance. You must first begin to think about yourself as so sick, as so poor, as so needy. Only then can you come and receive salvation from the Lord. But that is not Jesus' point. In fact, that would only be another form of Pharisaism. That would only bring up another attempt at self-righteousness by guilty feelings. You see, I'm so righteous because look how guilty I am. Look how guilty I feel. But that is not the point that Jesus is making. Jesus is making the point that the gospel is for everyone. For everyone. He makes the point clear by going to the sinners. That's of course his mission, that he comes to those who are even the worst of sinners. That makes the initial point clear. But he makes the point to the Pharisees as well. Notice what he says to them. He says, I came not to call the righteous, but sinners. Now initially you might think that Jesus is saying, those who are righteous, or even perhaps self-righteous like the Pharisees, they have no place with Jesus. They have no right to be close to him. They have no right to be his children. Again, turning this passage, I believe, on its head if you do that. But Jesus says to the Pharisees something that they should have known, that they would have known, especially those scribes of the Pharisees, those trained in the law. They knew virtually every passage in the Old Testament off the top of their heads. If not by memory, then at least they must have known it well. And so there is this passage, and it comes up more than once in the Old Testament. Paul actually quotes from Psalm 14, verse 2 and 3, in Romans 3, verse 10 to 12. None is righteous. No, not one. No one understands. No one seeks for God. All have turned aside. Together they have become worthless. No one does good. Not even one. The Pharisees knew this. They knew that even though they had such a great system of self-righteousness, a way by which they could obey this law and that law, they knew at the core they could not be righteous in themselves. They should have known it. Because the Old Testament made it clear on more than one occasion. And so when Jesus says, I've not come to call the righteous, but sinners, he is essentially saying to them, I have come to call everyone. That includes you, the Pharisees. Jesus is saying that he seriously and earnestly offers grace to everyone. Every single person. From the greatest of the Pharisees, from the most righteous, outwardly self-righteous or just righteous living person, to the worst of the sinners, the tax collectors and prostitutes of this world. And he's saying to those and everything and everyone in between, the gospel is for you. Come to me. If you are heavy laden, I will give you rest. He gives that promise. Now consider where this leaves you and me this evening. Perhaps you find in yourself more of a Pharisaic element. Perhaps you drift easily into self-righteousness and judgmentalism. You look at other people and say, well, at least I'm not as bad as they are. That's not to say that you're not a Christian. That's just to say that is the kind of direction in which your thoughts go. It's very common in people who grew up as Christians, who grew up in Christian homes. In fact, it's very common in anyone who has been a Christian for any length of period, because usually if you have been a Christian for a period, you begin to grow and you begin to exhibit the marks of grace. And so there is something of a life of holiness. And so it's easy to become self-righteous and think that those things come out of yourself and begin to think of yourself as better than other people. And then perhaps you begin to feel that you have earned the grace of God in some way. You think about the things that you do the things of service, the things that you have done for God in His kingdom. Well, if that is what you find in yourself, then hear the words of Jesus this evening. And He is calling you, and He's reminding you that you are equally in need of grace. Or perhaps you are more to the other side. Perhaps your experience is more of someone who consistently feels that they are not worthy of God's grace. Perhaps you know Christians and you always feel a little bit judged by Christians. You always feel that I'm not as good as them. Perhaps you know that you're a Christian, but perhaps you are surrounded by people who you think know more than you. So you feel, well, can I really be called a child of God? Perhaps you doubt and say, no, I have no right to be called a child of God. I don't know as much as these people. I don't live as well and righteously as these people. Then you may hear the word of Christ as an assurance. He says, I have come to call you to be mine. The gospel is offered to you as well. Now there's also another possibility, and that is that you swing from the one side to the other. Perhaps you have this self-righteous element in you, and then you recognize the self-righteous element, perhaps even as you were hearing me speak about that just now, and then think, oh no, I'm so self-righteous, I don't have the right to be called a child of God. And then you go into all kinds of corridors of self-doubt and uncertainty of salvation, and then you manage to fight back by looking to Jesus and say, well, look, I'm looking at Jesus, I find my sufficiency in Him, and then you go all the way back again to being more like the Pharisee. And that's also not uncommon in believers. No matter which one you are, no matter where you find yourself, Jesus says that His gospel is there for you. His grace is freely offered to everyone, and it is free grace. There is nothing that you have to do in order to receive it. Just come. Just accept Him as your Lord and Savior. But there's another application that comes up from this text, and I think actually this is something of a central application. And that we see when we realize and remind ourselves that Jesus takes His disciples with Him into this meal with these sinners. Jesus brings His disciples with Him. Now we are His disciples. And so Jesus has a meal where He brings His disciples with. In other words, in one sense, we ourselves should find ourselves in situations where we associate with sinners like Jesus did. You see, it is by doing this, by associating with such sinners, that we in our lives begin to reveal the same priority that Jesus showed. Jesus' willingness to associate with these people is something that in our lives should be shown to them. And it's extremely important that when we realize this, when we think about ourselves, at least when I think about myself, and I suspect that it is the case for many of us, and we find it as Christians quite hard to maintain friendships with unbelievers or people who live in open sin. We really go for that bad company corrupts good morals idea, and then think we're right not to associate with people who live in open sin. And the idea really is not to go on a guilt trip. That's not the point of what we see in this passage, and feel so bad about ourselves that we do not sufficiently associate with sinful people. The idea is that we realize that we are those sinful people, whether it is an inclination toward Pharisaic self-righteousness, or whether it is because of this heavy load of sin that we still carry with us. We are those sinful people to whom Jesus has offered the gospel freely. And having done so, we become those who can be in a fellowship meal, not like in the church's fellowship meal, but in meals where we spend time with people who are in sin. And just think about how Mark emphasizes this aspect. We have noticed in every section of Mark's gospel up to this point how Jesus' emphasis is on teaching and preaching and bringing the gospel. But notice in this section is the first time where we do not find that. Well, we found it in verse 13 where the crowds were all there and Jesus was teaching them. But now he is in a house, a feast held by one of his sinful disciples. And what does Jesus do? He reclines with the people. What a striking change. Whereas all throughout Jesus has been teaching and preaching, now he goes and has a meal with these people. Simply by being with them, he shows them that he is available for them. And we can do the same. By showing people that we are those who have received grace, we can show people that Christ can have and will have grace for them if only they come to him. Amen.